Hello, everybody. David Shapiro here, your personal chief AI officer. Today, I've got a returning guest. So this is Chad, who's been on several times. Chad is a great guy. He's been a longtime fan of my channel. We've collaborated on several projects, namely the ACE framework. But he's also a business owner and entrepreneur. And we were chatting the other day, and he told me that he was able to go through 240,000 voicemails with AI, and it only cost a couple $100s. And I said, hold on, stop the show. We got to talk about this. So we're basically we're going to tell you what he did, how much money he saved, how much time he saved, and then we're going to kind of expand the conversation. But I just wanted to just right up front, just tell you, like, this is about a 100x reduction in the cost of certain tasks. And that this is really kind of the meat and potatoes of where I think AI is going to go, at least for the next year or two. So, Chad, thanks for jumping back on. How you been?
Absolutely, Dave. Yeah, happy to be here. This is going to be. I'm really excited about this topic. I think a lot of the attention on AI has been on, like, what are the frontier models doing, and people want to see the wow of that. But there's so much good things happening on these next tier down models and on cost savings and optimization. So that's, I think we're going to explore that today, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, just right off the cuff, just like 2-minute elevator pitch. Can you tell us, like, what your business problem was and the approach that you went, and then we'll unpack all the details and implementation.
I mean, I can't quite frame it as a problem. I'm going to take a slightly different framing, which is, when you and I first met, you did a little bit of consulting for my company. And I think I really got my head wrapped around this, like, crawl, walk, run model you had offered to us. So it really is like looking for the low-hanging fruit. Where can we find easy wins to kind of master working with AI and build confidence, right? And so I made a few decisions. The first big decision was the first thing I do is not going to be customer facing. Because if it's back end, that means we can screw up and it won't affect our customers, right? And then the other piece was that, AI is kind of famous for making mistakes with hallucinating and stuff. So I wanted to pick something where the fact that it would make mistakes here and there wasn't that big of a deal. And so to me, with those two things together, some kind of data analysis made the most, right? And so I think it's more accurate to say that this is not some giant business win. It's more like I wanted to see how much value I could get out of AI for a low investment cost, and also, not spending too much time. So it was a learning exercise, but I am going to end up with some value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it aligns perfectly with just like, I just want to get my foot in the door, right? I mean, I think so much of what's happening, there's so much opportunity for value to be extracted from AI, but we all have to master, we have to go through the process of mastering these things to be able to really actually extract value instead of it just being potential, right?
Yeah.
So, right. And so I'll kind of briefly outline the project itself. But I wanted to make sure I framed it this wasn't us trying to, like, make some massive value breakthrough in a business. It was really more of a learning exercise that then produced all kinds of perspective shifts in me, right? So I run a telecom company. The exact details of it aren't that important, but part of what we have accumulate over time is voicemails. And we already had in our pipeline a service that would transcribe the voicemails into voicemail transcriptions. So I've been doing this for a couple of years. I've had, as I think, as you mentioned at the top, about 240,000 voicemails transcriptions just sitting around. And I'm like, this is the perfect starter project for AI, right? Like, I've got all this data, and I could try to extract some patterns from it to see, what anything we might learn. So I took those transcriptions and I whipped up a prompt template, and I went to extract. I'll just tell you what they were, and then I can talk a little about them. So sentiments, which is more like the mood. Is this person polite? Are they frustrated? The categories or topics that the message was about. A basic urgency level. Did this seem low, medium, or high urgency? What type of caller is calling? Is this a sales call? Is it a vendor? And what language is it in? For us, it's usually English or Spanish. So I'm like, okay, these are all very straightforward things I can pull out of these messages, right? And I had a crap ton of them. And so it took me probably not even an hour or two to get the prompt templating right? So I think the first thing is, and you probably will be able to give a more accurate answer about this, but it's kind of amazing to me that I can take an off-the-shelf language model now And all I need to do is know English, right? And I can begin to extract data from it. Whereas, what was it, 3 or 4 years ago, you would have had to have some machine learning expertise. You probably would have needed to fine tune a model to be able to do something at this level, right?
Right.
So there's the fact that it's drastically reduced the complexity of being able to even get at this data, and then the cost we can talk about a little bit more later, right?
Yeah.
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 So that's, yeah, the first piece is like getting all that going with just an off the shelf model wasn't that hard. That was a couple hours, but it was probably a week's worth of work to do what I would call a full pipeline automation. With 240,000 messages, I can't have it breaking down every 10 inferences. I can't have the thing breaking, right? So there's does the API call fail? Does it return the structured data in a format that I can't parse? Did the model just barf and it's not able to deal with what I'm serving it, that kind of stuff. And it took me a while to just flatten out all those bubbles so that I could get the pipeline to run smoothly. And I think my record was 120,000. I did 120,000 in a row without any hard failures, right? There were fail over things happening, but there was no hard failure, which is to me pretty incredible that I was able to get from a generative text model, which is not, it's producing some randomness, and yet I was able to rein it in and get it consistent enough to be able to output highly structured data that I was inserting into a database. Some of those database tables were literally like enum values where it would error out if I didn't get one of the selected values, and I still was able to do 120,000 inferences in a row without a hard failure. So that's saying something about these off-the-shelf models. If you prompt them correctly and dial it in, you can get a ton of consistent and structured data out of it. The other thing I would point out is that one of the things that took me the longest to do in the prompting was just figuring out a structure that I could get good, solid, consistent structured data out of, including to be able to test it with different models. So I wanted one prompt template that I could run that would give me structured data out that I could easily parse and then insert into a database. And I figured out that a combination of Markdown and XML was the best way to go. And the real breakthrough was using what I just call like an XML template or form. I give the language model the XML and just in between the tags and like fill this in with what I want.
Right.
Right.
There you
and
go.
So that kind of structure seems to work really well. Most models seem to understand XML pretty well, and that kind of lets its pattern matching, strengths come through when you just give it a template and say, complete this template.
Right.
And that was remarkably consistent. I mean, again, I needed to have failover mechanisms in place, but it's pretty shocking how I could use different mid-tier models and get really nice, consistent behavior. And again, I did some human analysis of this, and it was never 100% perfect, right? Like,
Sure.
It was getting the urgency wrong or the sentiment wrong here and there or whatever, but like 95 to 98% accuracy. And when you're doing a broad analysis like this over 240,000 messages, who cares if 5% are wrong? Like, you're still going to get the patterns.
Right.
Right. So it's it's sort of like, it's part of what I think where we can build confidence in extracting value from this kind of AI is like, well, you want to use it in ways where that margin of error, like you can have a margin of error, you can have mistakes, and they just don't matter very much.
Yep.
Right? As opposed to like a medical diagnosis where if you get that wrong, there's going to be a big problem. And I think there's a lot of opportunity where you can have this like sort of like good enough or close enough. The AI models can do this sort of close enough kind of performance now. So anywhere where good enough is good enough, you can begin to substitute human intelligence for these models, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So let's talk some more numbers and then into the implementation. So you told me that you did some estimates in terms of how much this would have cost to have humans do. You also did comparison versus different models. So one thing that I want to drive home is you used a relatively small, cheap model to do this work.
Yes. And I think again, I didn't really understand the value of this sort of cost optimized, these cost optimized models until I had to actually execute on a project like this. So as an example, with 240,000 transcriptions, and the way, say, something like Claude Opus cost, what was it at the time? It was $15 per million tokens of input and $75 per million token. It was, much like fairly expensive. So if I just did the math, it was many thousands of dollars to do that with Opus. So I'm like, well, that's not going to work with this many messages. I need to kind of go down in the ranks and see. And I was surprised and pleased to see that you could get orders of magnitude cheaper and still get the kind of performance for this kind of intelligence extraction, right? So
Yep.
just to give everybody some numbers. Now these are rough estimates, but I think the order of magnitude is more important than the exact number. So for the first thing I did was figure out like what would it have taken to have humans do this, right? And so again, roughly, it's like about 45 seconds for them to read the message, figure out what the different data was, and type it into a form, And if I took that, multiplied it times $7.25 an hour, which is the current U.S. federal minimum wage, I got $21,750. That's how much it would have cost to analyze 240,000, approximately, to have humans do it. Well, there is no way I would have paid that amount of money, first of all. This is something I think we might want to go a little deeper into, but like I just look at that number and I'm like, what's the gain we're going to get from this? I'm just making a hard business decision. How much money am I going to spend versus the return I'm going to get? And I'm like, there's no way I would spend $20,000 on this, right? So then the next iteration was Opus, and if you run the numbers there, it was about $8,400 to do this, which is, still half as much as it would be to have a human do it, right? Noticeably an improvement, but still, would I spend $8,400 to get this data? No. Then I analyze it with Gemini 1.5 Flash, which is one of Google's new models, and it's only compared to $15 per million tokens. This is 35 cents per million tokens, and if you run the math on that, it's about $200
Right.
to get this data. And so it was really shocking to me to run those numbers because the really big leap was not between humans and the most expensive models. It was between the most expensive model and a good enough model to get the data that I want, right? Like literally a whole order of magnitude difference.
Yep. Yeah. So like and I think that's a critical thing. So one, just at the beginning you said you just wanted to learn, you wanted an easy win.
Yep.
And you kind of looked around your organization to see like, where do we have data laying around? And I liked your decision framework to what you choose, but then also that idea of good enough, just aim for good enough to do the cognitive labor. And then also I'm imagining, so that 120,000 voicemail run that you did, how long did that take? I'm imagining that was hours instead of days.
It was
weeks, or
days.
months.
It was
Days,
days. It was days because I didn't parallelize it. Because again, it was a learning exercise, and it was easier for me to debug when I did it as a linear pipeline. When I had a failure, I could stop, look at the failure, fix it, and go on, right? And so if this was a regular pipeline where I was processing millions a month, of course I would parallelize it. But as an exercise, it made more sense to run it linearly. It's only 5 days total to do everything. So it's probably a day and a half or 2 days straight it ran. I just leave it run overnight, come in the morning and like, wow, it's still going.
There you go, chewing on it. I remember when I set up a project to de-wikify all of Wikipedia and store it in a local vector database. That was like 3 days straight. But yeah, and so another thing that happens that occurs to me is if you wanted to operationalize this and just make it automatic and that you could have it do this sentiment analysis as voicemails come in.
100%.
And then it's done permanently for relatively trivial cost. And so, like at a certain point, it's like, okay, $20,000 for a small or medium business, that's going to take, you'd have to justify that cost. $8,000, that's a little bit easier. That's, almost a third.
Sure.
But then $200, it's like, whatever, just do it.
Yeah. There's a level of cheap where it's like, you just I would take that bet all day long, right? Like if somebody said to me, this might improve your business by 0.001% and it'll cost you $200. Give me that bet all day long, right? It's just so cheap that it's worth taking. Yeah.
Yep.
And the investment was much more about my time, right?
Right.
Like the time and the mental, then cognitive load of actually writing the thing, getting it to perform consistently was a lot higher. Yeah. But I got a lot of, not only did I just learn and build confidence, but probably 50% of what I did could easily translate into almost any other AI enabled data pipeline I would want to build for my business, right? So the first lift is one of the hardest ones, I think, because you're building an understanding and all these systems that you have to put in place just to get the thing to work in the first place, right? Which is why if anybody's going to try to build any kind of process automation for their business, I would highly recommend just try to get the lowest hanging fruit you can, because you'll get the endorphin hit of the easy win, and you'll build all these support systems that allow you to take on the harder things more easily, right? Yep. It's a divide and conquer approach.
You'll get oriented to the technology. You'll learn what intuitively what works, what doesn't. So I have two follow-up questions. One, what value did you get? Obviously, like you're just talking about the value of learning, just so that you can become an AI power user. Tremendous long-term value in that. What is the short-term value of being able to get that data, like that 240,000 voicemail data?
So, yep. So I am in the process. I used, as I said, these mid-tier models, which we can talk about a little bit more about which ones people might want to use to do that, to do the actual extraction. And now I'm in the process, I haven't finished yet, of using the more top tier models like Sonnet 3.5 to actually write the code that will help me visualize all this, right?
Oh, cool.
So yeah, and I'm not quite there yet, but I mean, it's just astounding how much programming has become a collaboration for me. I got the data. I fed Sonnet. I think I just fed it the database in table structure of. I didn't even give it the actual data. I'm like, here's the table structure. Here's generally what it does. You tell me what data would be valuable to get. I wasn't even generating the ideas, right? It's just kind of like this, easy guidance. I just bump it at the edges. So it gives me all the ideas. I tell them which ones I like and I don't like. And then I'm like, okay, now tell me how to design the code. It puts it out. All right, write the first component. And I'm just going through that process. So that's going to give me the full value, which again is like multiplied a number of times because I don't have to think of it all or do it all myself.
Right.
But an example of a high level thing, because I just looked at really high level numbers, we found out that a great majority of the messages that are coming were in English. And we have a lot of people who pay for Spanish support in the product that we provide. And the gap between how many people are paying for Spanish support and how many people are actually leaving messages that are Spanish was very noticeable. So that was a very top level thing, like, wow, almost nobody's using the service they're paying for. What do we do with that information, right?
Right.
And I'm sure there's 20 more insights like that waiting as I just get to the place where I can visualize the data a little bit better.
Yep. Well, I remember, back when I started my IT career, like data mining was a whole discipline, and like data extraction, because getting good data is the hardest step. But imagine if you had to have a data analyst for $80,000 a year doing this over weeks, but it's like you just have a conversation in real time with Claude, say, here's the table structure, what do we do next? Visualize it. So I'll be curious to hear in the future, like what business value you get from that in the short term. Obviously, long-term business value, this is an entry point. Like, I don't think you can overstate the long-term value for you as a business owner, entrepreneur, to get your feet wet and get this early win.
It changes the way I think, right?
Yeah.
That was the two most important things that happened, where it gave me confidence and some new skills at being able to actually execute something like this and get value out of AI. But it also changes the way I think, right? So I think the example you and I were talking about, I can't remember if we did, but when I first started to make a lot of money in my life, like I'd been poor for a long time and I got good at programming and was making money. It was nice to make more money, but the real change didn't happen until I both made more money and I shifted my consciousness around money, right? And so I think this is almost the reverse of that. It's like I'm used to thinking about, the application of intelligence in business as being oftentimes a rather expensive thing, whether it's time or money. And now, like, I have this hard data from this experiment. It's like there are areas where getting intelligence into my business could be unbelievably cheap. So that's the thing that happened. But then there's how do I change my consciousness to benefit from that, right? It's like I can expand this whole new way of thinking about business in general or about my business. And that takes a little bit of like adjustment to the way I see my business and I see the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, so I want to unpack that a little bit because, as everyone is kind of coming to terms with artificial intelligence and jobs and what does it mean? And of course, the cost of training frontier models is going up exponentially.
Yep.
But you used a very inexpensive, relatively small model to do this. And so adapting the way that you think about these things and cost. So when you say, here's the question I'm trying to get at. When you say you're changing the way that you think about the cost and time of getting intelligence into the business, like what in your mind, what is intelligence? Like, let's just start there. Like, how do you mentally think about or characterize intelligence in this context?
Right. So I'm going to answer the question with by staying focused on what I think these mid-tier models are capable of, right? So how far back do we have to roll the clock? Not even 10 or 20 years. There was no AI model that could do this, right? So it's already replaced some degree of human intelligence. So if I just do a very loose translation and say, okay, what other processes in my business could require an equivalent level of intelligence? How many decisions are people making where the level of intelligence doesn't get any harder than, what would you call it, like basic pattern matching and making a decision? I mean, I'm just running a typical small business, but we have hundreds of processes, right? And most of those processes are some kind of a pipeline, right? And in those pipelines, oftentimes there's decisions that need to be made. There's probably hundreds of opportunities that are available where currently human involvement is happening, but the level of reasoning that has to get done isn't very high.
Right.
Right. And because it's so crazy cheap to get that level of intelligence and put automation in, it just seems like it could go in so many different places. Now, I'm still a little fresh on it, so I don't have a dozen examples to tell you.
Sure.
But I feel very confident that, I mean, I know how many processes are in my business, and I know a lot of those things are not, that they don't require years of human expertise in order to make these decisions, you know? So one of the ways I think about business is like my company, which is pretty small, needs all of the same basic business processes that a company like Google does. Right? I mean, that's one of the things that makes small business so hard is I have to have a sales department and marketing and billing and customer support, right? Like all the same things that a giant company has to have. So it makes it much harder for a small business to really excel at these, having, you know, all these different things that have to run like the business body, if you will, right? Anything I want to do in the business world, I got to have the body of all these different components that stand a business up and make it run.
Right.
And most of those things are not our area of expertise. You know, like the value that my business provides in the world has nothing to do with how we collect money, right? But our money collection process is very time and employee intensive, and there are standard ways to do it,
right?
And there are processes to do that, and there are decisions that need to be made that don't require a tons of experience or intelligence. Not all of them, of course, right? Because we were talking about earlier is that it's not so much that the short term doesn't seem to me like AI is going to wholesale replace employees.
Right.
But there's still tons of opportunities to take the low hanging fruit of where human involvement is happening. It's just completely unnecessary.
Right.
You know, like why would you hand wash laundry when you can put it in a washing machine now? It's kind of like that, except now we have to actually see those things in business processes that are like hand washing laundry, and we don't need to do it anymore. Right.
Makes sense.
That's the vision part that I'm hoping to get deeper into, and I hope more people will see it.
Absolutely.
I think it's going to remove a lot of drudgery, honestly.
Yeah.
Like it's probably going to make work a lot more fun.
Well, so, because one thing that you said that really stands out is you looked at the capabilities of the models and you say, okay, what is this model actually capable of? And of course, at such a low price point, even if it does take a week or two to automate, say, okay, well, it can do this thing. You build a little widget that automates a business process.
Yep.
It can do it forever for basically effectively zero money, you know,
effectively
100x reduction over human cost. So then it's like, okay, well, why not do it? And why not integrate as many of those widgets as you can into your business where they fit? So on that topic, I want to pivot and kind of talk about so you talked about one use case. Have there been any other use cases that it's not ready for or it's not good for yet that you've explored? Or even speculate, like anything that it couldn't do?
Well, yeah, there's lots of things I think the mid-tier models can't do. The billing stuff is probably the easiest example to give. Like I would kill to have AI that could just do all the billing stuff. But when I've looked, you know, like, can this thing just enter things in QuickBooks for us and figure out how to match payments and things like that? It's like the cost of a mistake is really high. How do you just building the interface so that it knows the data that it's looking at? I mean, it just seems like too high of a cost right now. And I think part of the problem is not that these AI models aren't capable. It's just getting to the gold of it. It's like, this model is smart enough to do things, but how do I actually get it to integrate fully into my business? You know, how do I make a model talk to QuickBooks as a practical example? Right. Okay. That's not a trivial task, right? I think this comes out in where you've seen how good AI is at writing code. And yet I don't think anybody's really cracked the nut on how can AI just completely manage a whole project. Because that's a much harder, right? It has to have a general familiarity with the entire pattern of the project. It has to be able to know where to look to find things. And that particular thing happened yet. And I think that's kind of another example. I really don't think it's because Opus isn't smart enough to manage an entire open source project repository.
Right.
It's just we haven't figured out how to get it to see it in a way that where it can do that consistently. Yeah. So I think what I said to you earlier was like the oil's in the ground. It's there. it's kind of hard to get to right now. And I think
Yep.
that's one of the challenges, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's like a brain in a jar, right? Like the interface, like connecting
Hmm.
that brain to the outside world, giving it all the hands and the eyes that it
Yes.
needs. I wonder if there's an opportunity for someone to just create a desktop, like a robot user that's driven by Opus. So just like give it like its own little, virtual keyboard, virtual mouse,
Right.
virtual screen, and it can log in and do everything that you need. Because they can, I mean, with images, it can tell you like click on this now.
Yep.
So that would be an interesting pipeline to build. Let's talk about kind of the broader social and economic implications. So
Hmm.
what I want to ask is like it sounds like like you said, it's not replacing any employees. I'm guessing you haven't let anyone go because of this yet, or
No, I haven't. I've actually promised my employees that I won't. We're a small company,
hmm
and I've just said flat out said to them like, if 5 years from now you only have 10% of your work to do because of AI, awesome. You can keep your salary, you can keep your job,
right,
So yeah, I'm hopeful that a lot of small businesses will have that same kind of angle. I mean, when you're a giant company, I get why you would let hundreds or thousands of people go, but we
hmm
don't have that many employees. And
right,
I'm providing them the encouragement that what's going to happen is they're going to get nothing but benefit out of AI, which makes
right,
them much less anxious about the whole thing too. If
yep,
you're working for IBM or whatever, how many companies now have you? Amazon had lost 100,000 employees over the last 3 years.
something like that.
So that's automation. Somebody was it IBM? Somebody it was laid off 7,500 employees in preparation for automating a bunch of stuff. So I imagine people at these bigger companies are pretty anxious,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, and I think it
Yeah.
was the U.S. Post Office actually laid off like thousands of mid-level managers because they're
Right.
like, you know what, we can just, all of the emails, all the chats, we can just aggregate that with AI and
Yep.
turn it into a report.
If you have a company where you have 5 to 50 employees, I just don't see the benefit in laying people out. Like,
Mm.
there's just not nearly as much benefit because in our company, people wear a bunch of different hats. And if
Right.
we're going to need to have human intelligence in the loop, there's just no even practical way to let them go anytime soon
Makes sense.
without more like AGI or ASI
Right.
in the mix, right?
What
Yeah.
are you doing so you already mentioned to encourage them, you'd say, hey, look, AI is coming. If it makes us more productive, great. Are you doing anything else to empower them, like sending them to training or like, here's a license of Chat GPT, everyone go use
Yes.
it. Like, what all are you doing to empower that?
There's a couple different things. One
Okay.
is I have given them. I think it's just ChatGPT right now. So we have a company account that people can use it. I've encouraged them. I've done little training sessions. Here's how you prompt, that kind of thing. And then the other big thing I do is I just try to continue to paint the AI context. I mean, I think you have pointed out that there's a very small percentage of people who are actually tracking any of this stuff, right?
Right.
It's whatever 2.5%. It's very small. Like we're the early adopters. And so without overburdening my employees, I just try to drop pieces of context about here's what I'm seeing happening.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very passive education, but it kind of helps to over time orient them to where to get to think more about it and to have some awareness of it instead of just being blindsided by it. So those are the two main things I'm doing is giving the access to the really basic tools like Claude or ChatGPT. I haven't had much luck getting them to do more active trainings, or I haven't had any luck at figuring out deeper level integrations where I can
Right.
say, hey, like we're going to put AI into product X and it's going to help your productivity. I just haven't figured out how to do that yet.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder, honestly, than
Mhm.
just giving somebody ChatGPT and saying, "Hey, you can," and let me show you these 10 things real quick where it can help with your productivity. You have this thing you need to translate from one format to another. Don't do that by hand anymore, right? So these are
Right.
the kind of things that, again, but it's low hanging fruit, right? It's a lot easier to empower a person with that chat interface than it is to get it to integrate with our email software. I can't believe how hard it is to find. I would have thought by now there would be companies crawling all over each other to do better email automation. But
Yeah.
every time I've looked, it's like, it doesn't seem that impressive to me. And not in a business context, right? Not like
Right.
this thing's going to analyze, or like the simplest thing in the world to me would be it can analyze an email thread, maybe look in our database a little bit for customer information, and then offer a reply to our customer service representative, like pre-write the reply.
There you go.
Even that, which I think would be a huge time saver. I cannot find a product that feels
Yeah.
like it does that well. And it's crazy to me that I can't. I mean, I've considered writing it myself, but I'm like, there has to be somebody working on this, right?
Yeah, Microsoft and Google are definitely working on that because, like, I don't know if you Gmail, it's like Gemini like pops up every time now.
Yes.
And Microsoft with, Office 365 and Copilot. I know that is one thing that Microsoft is working on doing is they just want Copilot everywhere. It's not
Right.
there yet, but it'll be there. But I think what you've observed is really important. Is there is a lot of low hanging fruit, and some of it has been picked. I don't know about all, but the next level of integration is the next harder part. Is because there's all kinds of legacy systems,
Yes.
email exchanges, QuickBooks, which is really designed from the ground up to be a human used application. And there are a lot of platforms out there that are API driven. Microsoft Azure, Google, AWS, all of them have APIs,
Right.
but still we don't have the agent frameworks that are good enough to keep track of everything and all that stuff. So
And you have to think about the cost too, right? Like
Right.
to me, the entry level question is, what is the cost of a mistake?
right,
Because AI is still going to make a lot more dumb mistakes than a competent human is.
right,
Right. And so if cost of mistake is it wipes out all of my customer data in QuickBooks, not willing to take it. Right? But if cost of mistake is I have 5% of this data analytics I did was analyzed incorrectly, that's
Right.
fine. Right.
Yep.
So yeah, that's another piece of it too.
Well, and also over 240,000 voicemails, what would be the error rate of, offshore humans doing that?
Right. Yeah, that's not going to be zero either. I 100% agree with you.
Yeah,
Yep.
And so it's like you get far more consistent results, and it's far faster and far cheaper. So it's like, all right, even if it's not quite as good or comparable to a low paid human to do, like Mechanical Turk or whatever, it's still going to be worthwhile from an economic. It's an economically compelling enough story.
I want to add this before I forget. So
Yeah.
So go back to the example of the email thing. Like that would be awesome. Like I just keep thinking about the kind of productivity enhancement. If every single customer support email came in, there was a prefabbed reply, but done well integrated. It's read the whole thread. It has access to the customer data. And so in that instance, it would offer a reply to the customer service representative. And even if it was only right 70 or 80% of the time, it would still be a huge time saver, right? If it gives a bad reply, you just delete it and do your own thing, right?
Right.
But that's getting even that seems like there's a pretty high degree of integration, and I think that's why we're not seeing these products. But this sort of initial project it is kind of taught me like, what if you just think in terms of like really simple pipelines? I love the Unix pipeline philosophy. Where you're just like something comes out here and then you put it into the next thing and you can just build a pipeline that way. Are there really simple pipelines in my business processes where if I just insert this level of intelligence in this spot to make a simple decision that will improve the quality of the pipeline, right? That is not the same kind of complete solution that it's going to write email replies for me. But I really do think that's going to be easier to get to than these more full-throated dreams that everybody has about AI doing everything. Right. So that's really more how I'm looking at it. It's like, I want to see my business now as like a series of simple pipelines. Where can I put simple intelligence in top to help optimize these pipelines?
Yeah, no, that's
the kind of consciousness I'm operating from now.
That's absolutely how I've looked at it, because especially like in a more dynamic environment or a poorly defined environment, like it might feel a little bit more chaotic, but by and large, it's, billables, right? A billable comes in, there's a standard set of routes and procedures. I remember one consultation client I had more than a year ago. It was, they had, bills coming in, and I was like, just ask, give it a menu, give the model a menu and say, there are these 6 departments that it can go to. Where does this letter go to? And they're like, oh, that worked really well. It's just like automatic routing of tickets, automatic routing of letters. But again, it sounds like the integration is the hard part. So in the grand scheme of things, in terms of what AI is capable of today, because it sounds like the model, the intelligence of the models is far above what it needs to be. And integration is actually the biggest.
It was one of the big insights I had from doing this project.
Okay,
like, wow, these not just these smartest models are plenty smart. These mid-tier models that are crazy cheap are plenty smart to do all kinds of good work.
Right.
That is, I'm wondering if that's a kind of a common misconception people have is, oh, AI is not smart enough to do X, Y, and Z. And I don't think that's right anymore. I think it is, and it's more just how do you get that completely, capable intelligence to integrate with your processes so that you can get reliable results. That seems to be the real problem. Yeah.
Well, and it might take a bottom to top rebuild. I know that like Apple and Windows, they're going to say like, oh, it's going to be like the Copilot is going to be built in, like the new Chat GPT desktop app is going to be able to just like watch what you're doing.
Yep.
Like that level of like true co-pilot is going to be required. But of course, version 1 comes out. Who knows? Maybe that could be better, especially if you have some workflow intelligence built into the backend. And I don't mean old school workflow intelligence. I mean like where it's keeping track of the workflows that it's designing and executing in real time. But yeah, so I guess broader, because okay, so here's kind of where I'm going to jump off into more speculative territory. If model intelligence isn't the bottleneck, but integration and deployment is, which that's going to take a lot of time and effort.
It's one of the things going to slow down the job revolution, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just the rubber meeting the road. It's like you gotta actually make it work. Right.
Yep.
It's so much easier to model something in your mind than it is to make it work in the real world every time. Right.
Here, I just thought of a metaphor. Let me know how this resonates with you. It's like going back to 1900 and you drop a Ferrari V12 engine. It's a powerful engine, but they don't know how to use it. Right?
How do you put this into anything?
Right.
Yeah.
Or if you go back to the 1950s or 1960s and you give them a Pentium 3, they don't know how to use it yet, right? Because they don't have the rest of the infrastructure
you need
around
the supporting infrastructure. That's
Okay.
true. Yep. I just want to touch on too. I think there's two ends to the challenge. One is the one we just talked about, but the other one, I guess I do believe this, that even the top tier models in the direction I'm seeing has still not cracked what I would call like complex multi-step reasoning. Philip over at AI Explain talks about this. He's got plenty of evidence, right? And I'm just like, this is what I'm seeing too, you know?
Yep.
So, and that end where it's like, there's this dream that AI can do all your work for you. There's some pretty big nuts that have to get cracked for that to happen.
Yeah.
Right. And so I like this middle ground where you're just like, you've got massive amounts of intelligence in front of you. It can't do that stuff yet, but it still can do all this really good work, because so much of what we do as humans, I think, is simple pattern matching and decision making on those patterns. Like lots and lots of the stuff we do in work is like that, you know?
Yeah.
So that's where the gold can be mined right now, I'd say. And it is in the implementation. It's not in the lack of intelligence at that level. Right.
Well, and I was thinking about like some of the lowest hanging fruit that I use is like every now and then I'll just copy like all of my YouTube comments. And of course, with the gigantic context windows, I ask, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, I'm just like, hey, do a sentiment analysis on these comments. Tell me what does my audience think? What are they confused about? How do they feel? And it's just like, cool. Like, here's, I gave it a few. Yeah. Right. And I'm just like, great. Okay, cool. Like it aggregates all of this, cuts out of the fluff. And it just, it picked up on like a conversation where like a polite debate broke out in the comment section, and at the end it's like someone said something like, oh yeah, like this is just Dave's audience, like we're not gonna this isn't Reddit. And I was like, cool, I appreciated that sentiment. I went and found the comments and I was just like, good job guys. But yeah, so in terms of other like well actually no, I want to unpack something that you said. So kind of one of the things that you mentioned is you don't anticipate that it's or rather you anticipated that the difficulty of implementation and the lack of infrastructure is going to be what kind of slows down the revolution. So can you give me a little bit more context? Like, what do you see as like, when you say like jobs revolution, do you mean like unemployment shooting up or something else? Yeah,
I think it would be unemployment shooting up, complete replacement. I suppose, I mean, I've never worked in a giant corporate environment, so I think that would be different. So I'm only speaking about the small business side of things.
Sure.
But most small businesses don't have the kind of resources to do this kind of integration. That bottleneck is very real. I have the benefit of that. I've been a programmer my whole life and a systems designer, and I'm really curious about this stuff. And so I'm spending sweat equity to make these breakthroughs. But if you've got people, like if you've got a small business where nobody has that interest or that expertise, they're going to have to spend money on somebody like you or me to do it.
Right.
And that's going to cost some real money. Right. And so I think that's going to be part of the bottleneck. Maybe there'll be a trickle down where the bigger companies will have enough resources to build systems and then resell them to the smaller companies to do some of this implementation stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess not going to be bottom up, I don't think.
Most CEOs are not infrastructure engineers and not building agentic frameworks like you are.
And most small businesses probably will not have a chief AI officer.
Right.
Anytime sooner. Yeah. Anytime in the near future.
Or ever. Right. They're going to have to wait until QuickBooks does the AI integration for them. Yeah, exactly.
That is exactly correct.
Yep.
And some of that, I mean, there's tough. That's part of what makes the decisions tough is this lack of resources. I personally see the benefit but I have to weigh that against the resources I have, both in time and money for my small business to be able to extract the value.
You're right.
You know?
Right. Well, it strikes me as we're talking about this aspect of it, like, the lack of infrastructure, the difficulty of integration. Like it almost strikes me that there might be, like, particularly those of us paying attention at the frontier here, like this frustration. It's like, because I have told people, like, the model is smart enough, you're not prompting it right, you're not giving it the right structure or the right process. And people are like, no, the model's not really that smart. I'm like, you don't just ask it to solve a problem with one prompt. Use reflection, use planning, use, feedback, whatever. But still, even if you can do all that in a lab environment or a test bed environment, then there's still that gap to jump to real commercial productivity. Like, I kind of find that frustrating. Like, do you find that, like, is it just like, well, you throw your hands up, like there's only so much we can do? Or is it kind of like back to business as usual? Does it make you feel better? Because it seems like you're pretty relaxed about the whole thing. Like, yes, there is low-hanging fruit, but you're not really worried about, your employees or anything else.
I mean, I'm more relaxed now because I don't feel like my business is under threat. I think when we were really on the exponentials, like when it was at full bore and everybody thought this is going to keep going exponentially into the near future, I'm like, AI is just going to be able to do everything my business can do, and I'm going to lose it. I mean, I would imagine anybody who's paying attention will be experiencing some flavor of that anxiety. But I just have I don't think anybody knows what the future is. It's so crazy to me. Like, there's some of the smartest people in the world are looking at this, and you've got wildly different opinions. Yudkowsky on one side and whoever on the other side. So I don't think anybody really knows, but I have a lot more confidence now that there's going to be more. Businesses are going to have more time to adjust. There's also, I actually am a huge fan of what I would just call friction. I think there are places where friction is really helpful. It gives you time to make sense of things. You can learn when you're pressing up against something. It kind of challenges you in a way where you learn. And this, where things were happening with AI so fast, is like, oh my God, we're going to move so fast. There's almost no friction between where we are now and how is anyone going to be able to cope with that, right? And so the fact that there's especially the implementation problems create a lot of friction, right?
Yep.
And the good side of that is I think it gives people time to adjust.
Yeah.
And I can have a much more playful attitude about it. It's like, all right, what kind of thing do I want to tackle next? I'm not tackling it because my business is under threat. I'm tackling it because it's an interesting problem, or I think I can get a 2% improvement in this one area type of thing.
Right.
So that
It does feel like there's a lot less FOMO as I'm talking to other, entrepreneurs in the space or thought leaders. There was definitely, like, last year, 2023, for those of us at the cutting edge, so much FOMO. It was just like, oh my God, we got to keep up or we're all going to get left behind. But now, like, we're catching our breath and it's like, okay, like there is increasing friction. And so, like, in some of my more recent videos, I've been talking about the exponentially rising costs of frontier models. That's one point of friction. But now, like, just the mundane nitty gritty that you're talking about of just plugging A into B is providing more and more friction as we kind of move forward.
I mean, look at the numbers I gave before. It was like 2 hours to get the prompting right and a week or two to get the full system running. That alone illustrates that it's there. There's this. I mean, I think you probably had this when you did your automation engineering, right? There's like, you can get 90 to 95% of the way there.
Yep.
With a draft and a few iterations. And there's that, like, last 5 or 10% it can seem to take forever. There's all these little implementation details, and some of the maximum friction is right at the end.
Oh yeah. No, so for some background for the audience, I actually ran into a fan in the wild yesterday. Happens every now and then. And he was in cybersecurity. And I was talking about, like, man, I wish I was still doing infrastructure automation with access to, GPT and Claude, because there was I built entire orchestration platforms just to analyze manifest files because I didn't have NLP. I had to do it all in regex. So I spent weeks slicing and dicing with rule-based evaluations and regex to figure out, like, what is this virtual machine manifest file saying? Because there's different ways of interpreting it. But now I could just literally just plug it into, GPT-4 or, Claude 3 or whatever, and just say, convert this to an XML so that I can deploy this virtual machine automatically. It would be a single step and it would take a couple minutes to write the prompt rather than several weeks of regex.
This is making me think of, like, almost like the friction is migrated up. Now we have NLP to be able to reduce the friction there. But I am facing plenty of friction when I'm using these large language models to implement things in the real world.
Right.
So it didn't, the AI revolution didn't make friction disappear.
Right.
It now is present in the actual implementation of the AI.
Right.
And maybe at some point AI will eat its own dog food enough to actually remove the friction too. But we're not anywhere. I don't think we're close to that yet.
Yeah. No, I'm reminded of the, and I think this will be a great place to end because we're close to the top of the hour. I'm reminded of the theory of constraints, which is anytime you alleviate one constraint, you're just going to find the next bottleneck. And so like models as they are today solved NLP. You don't need, like you said at the beginning, you don't need an ML engineer. You don't need an NLP engineer.
You need to know how to speak English. That's
right.
it.
You need English, but we solved NLP. Now anything that you wanted to do in the past that could be done with NLP is trivial, almost doesn't cost anything except for just some experimentation. But now the next thing is, now we need integration engineers. Now we need API engineers. Now we need a different level. We got to the next level of friction, the next level of bug.
If I may make a call out to whoever does these things, it would be really great if we had some kind of RFC for getting structured data out of language models. Like RFC, whatever number is like, if a language model complies to this, you can say output is JSON and you will always get JSON.
Right.
Just that one thing, like being able to take these NLP models and because that's the transition. It's a big part of the transition, right? It's like we've got all these legacy systems that do all this really valuable stuff. It's like the arms and the legs to the intelligence. But when they can't interface, and one of the primary reasons they can't interface is because you can't get reliable structured data out of these generative models.
Yep.
So if we had some kind of standard way to do it, all models have to be trained output JSON, XML, and whatever, and when you do it, you're going to get a really high success rate. That would go a long way to reducing that kind of friction, I think.
Yep. No, I've heard that a lot of companies are standardizing around at least OpenAI's API schema. Now, obviously, API schema is not necessarily the model, but that's part of it. So I completely agree. Like, it's like the early days where we have, different chip manufacturers, different microprocessors, all with different standards.
Yep.
And now we've kind of standardized around a few instruction sets.
Exactly.
And I still think of transformers as the next iteration of CPUs. Like it's just a cognitive processing unit.
But that took a while, right? I mean, I think there's a period of time where you don't want to standardize too fast because you want there to be room for experimentation. It's frustrating for people like us who are implementers to not have a good solid interface. But I think it's right to have it. Yeah, to have the Wild West for a while.
We're doing things the hard way. I remember configuring RAID arrays manually, and now you just plug it in, and it's just like it's RAID 6 or whatever. You don't even have to think about it anymore.
It just recognizes it.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, all right.
We'll get there. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Chad, for this great talk and just sharing your experiences from the front lines.
Yep.
This has been great. Do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom that you want to share with the world?
We covered it all. I mean,
okay.
I'm hopeful that I can figure out ways to get more low-hanging fruit out of my business. And I hope more people will experiment with it and share like we have done here.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. This has been David Shapiro, your personal chief AI officer, and Chad, a good friend of mine and fellow explorer. So yeah, thanks for watching, and we will see you all next time. Cheers.